On September 29, 1833, Madrid's royal palace is basked in an overwhelming silence. Within the palace grounds, a 48-year-old man lies deathly ill in his royal room, his body riddled with a venereal disease, the result of one of his many sexual escapades. Ferdinand III, King of Spain, is suffering an ignominious end in severe syphilis as a lifetime engrossed in the most depraved pleasures wreaks havoc on his poor body. His moans echo down the palace halls as his doctors struggle with the ulcers throughout his body. The irony is painfully obvious. The man who anointed himself the knight championing Catholic moral and Spanish tradition's defense is suffering from the consequences of his own transgressions. But how did Ferdinand II become the most depraved king, and arguably the most hated, in Spanish history? To understand this king's ethical life's demise, we must first turn to the beginning of his life and unpack the sordid details which diminished the Spanish crown forever. Ferdinand was born on October 14, 1784, in a Spain that had been one of the great powers of Europe. He was the son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, and was raised in a palace steeped in corruption where illicit sexual deeds and cunning affairs were more common than royal audiences. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa, had numerous lovers, and among them was Manuel Godoy, who had essentially ruled Spain through the royal family since Ferdinand's youth. The Queen had made him her highly regarded lover. Ferdinand was a disquieting character for a little boy. By age 10, he was well on his way to extreme acts of cruelty against his pets and servants. Accounts from the time indicate that he derived great pleasure in torturing and humiliating cats, and that he would frequently ask the servants to do humiliating things at his request. Ferdinand's tutors, horrified by his behavior, tried to reform him. However, tutors who attempted to correct the prince's behavior were often fired or moved on to other jobs as they could no longer tolerate him. Ferdinand's education, academically, socially, or morally, was an absolute failure. While most princes across Europe were enduring heavy academic workloads, Ferdinand could only think of satisfying the most base of instincts. He denied his academics, he shunned art and literature, and he could only be shocked by his ignorance of matters of state and governance. His only real pleasure was surveilling the private behavior of the courtiers by peering through holes he had asked be dug into the walls of his palace. In 182, at age 18, Ferdinand married his cousin Maria Antonia of Naples. This marriage was intended to civilize him, but it did the complete opposite. Court reports intimate that Ferdinand subjected his young wife to humbling and degrading sexual humiliations. Maria Antonia was left traumatized by her husband's abuse. As a semi-literate, she began to live almost in isolation, intentionally distancing herself from her husband as much as possible. The situation became incredibly worse when Ferdinand realized that he could use his station to exploit the women at court. He began to blackmail the ladies-in-waiting, threatening to sully their families if they did not acquiesce to his twisted desires. He specifically developed an obsession with married women, claiming that he could subjugate their husbands by seducing their wives. Many nobles were forced to suffer the shame of having their wives ruined in order to maintain their position at court. In 186, the suspicious dying at 21 of Maria Antonia raised eyebrows with the court physicians. Although it was said officially that she died of tuberculosis, the whispers continued that she was poisoned or had died of a broken heart due to her husband's terrorizing abuse. Ferdinand felt no unique sadness for the passing of his wife, flippantly claiming that he was now free to pursue better pleasures. The Napoleonic invasion of Spain in 188 should have provided a moment of national unity, but Ferdinand viewed the national disaster as an opportunity for personal ambition. Ferdinand's cowardice was displayed most notably during the Aranjuez Mutiny, which forced his father Charles IV to abdicate. Existing in a social climate that was intensely hostile to the French, he unexpectedly did not lead a revolt against the French, but rather summoned Napoleon to secretly assemble a negotiation to surrender. Ferdinand offered to surrender Spain with France for promises for himself. The meeting between Ferdinand and Napoleon revealed who was going to the future Spanish king. French witnesses described Ferdinand as an undignified man who begged the French emperor and, through directness, offered any concession for the preservation of his personal prerogatives. While Napoleon was not entirely shocked to be dealing with cowards on a throne, Ferdinand's loathsome cowardice shocked Napoleon, who wrote he had never met a more loathsome worm on the throne than French. The people-corrupt French servants organized orgies with other Spanish exiles, and he contracted his first venereal disease from a local prostitute. Letters, intercepted by French spies, revealed his continued requests for women for company, and his utter indifference to the plight of the Spanish people. In short, a total lack of mores or morality. Ferdinand was returned to Spain in 1814. New beginnings were welcome, but all that meant in this case was the return of tyranny and immorality with the return of Ferdinand. One of the first things he did was to restore the Inquisition. In doing so, he was not being religious in any sense. Rather, he simply knew that an inquisitorial court would give him unchecked power to persecute enemies and extort families for their relatives to be released from heresy prisons. Political crimes were also known as heretics. His preferred method to extort sex was to accuse women of heresy, promising absolution. Says a lot about honor. The second marriage was in 1816 to Isabel of Banza and was more base than the first. Isabel, a Portuguese princess and all of 19 years old, was basically sold by her family to be connected politically. Now 32, Ferdinand was already a man of vice, and soon began to subject his young wife to far worse abuse than that suffered by his first wife. The Spanish court devolved into a nest of degenerate behavior, as the man now known as Ferdinand III engaged in a de facto system of royal favors, openly bartering public offices for the time and favors of men who would make their wives or daughters available for the king's pleasure. He appointed ministers of the crown not because of their capabilities, but rather based on how attractive their attractive female relatives were. The king had a sort of unofficial harem at the palace as well, in the form of women who were officially ladies-in-waiting, who were there solely to engage in sexual acts and fulfill the king's desires. Ferdinand's sexual behavior was so vulgar that he shocked even the softest of morals of his time. Many of the earliest secret court documents discovered centuries later also revealed his fetish for subservient humiliation and sadism. Cecile's was a last-ditch attempt to have an heir. Maria Cristina, the one who was 23 years old at the time, was the only wife to survive Ferdinand, since he was already dreadfully ill. He was dying when she married him, probably because the syphilis he had contracted during a night of debauchery with a couple of prostitutes was now eating into his brain, muting the damage he could do. Ferdinand had been suffering for quite a while at this point. A syphilitic affliction had found the virulent bacteria eating into his body and producing gross, horrid ulcers, along with endless suffering and a holistic collapse of his mind. His doctors had taken measures to cover all of it up, but they could not disguise the horrible weight of his situation. There were court murmurs for years about how tragic it was for the king, who was now a horrible specimen of a human being both morally and physically. By the end of September 1833, he was in critical condition. Ferdinand III lay dying in his chambers, forsaken by nearly everyone. His former victims had either perished or fled, and his courtiers shunned him due to the repugnant odor of his wounds. Even his physicians attended only out of a sense of professional duty. The man who once instilled fear in defenseless women was now utterly vulnerable consumed by his own immoral choices. Death ultimately arrived on September 29th, concluding one of the most disgraceful reigns in European history. Ferdinand III died as he lived, in a sordid and contemptible manner. There were no genuine tears shed at his funeral, only the relief of a nation that had finally liberated itself from its tormentor. His only legitimate daughter, the future Isabel II, inherited a devastated kingdom and a crown forever tainted by her father's depravity. The legacy of Ferdinand III is among the darkest in the Spanish monarchy. In 20 years of effective rule, he turned Spain from a formidable power into a backward and odious state. He squandered the nation's honor, lost its colonies, and diminished its stature in the world from an obsession with carnal gratification. Ultimately, he provided a lamentable example of how absolute power could corrupt anyone completely. More than 200 years later, Ferdinand III is regarded as a wolf who used the crown to gratify the basest impulses of human nature rather than a king. This cautionary tale reminds us that not even royal blood can shield one from the consequences of a life immersed in vice and cruelty. The most depraved king in Spanish history died as he lived, and deserved, isolated, ailing, and odious to everyone who knew him.